Welcome to Rooted to Thrive, conversations to elevate our humanity. I'm your host, Rochelle Peterson-Ansari, Professor P for short. This is your podcast sanctuary for cultivating mindsets and skills to elevate our shared humanity. We're taking a deep dive into practical strategies to evolve as anti-racist, culturally competent, and inclusive individuals and leaders. In each episode, we're bringing you real-world examples and actionable takeaways. We're going to talk about personal growth, fostering connection, and creating positive change that dismantles systemic barriers and creates environments where all of us are valued, empowered, and activate our collective power. This is Rooted to Thrive. Hey everyone, welcome back to Rooted to Thrive, conversations that elevate our humanity podcast. I am your host, Professor P, Rochelle Peterson-Ansari. So glad that you're joining us today for another conversation to help us center human dignity. Now, today we have a very special person in my life, Amber Williams, director of college houses, one of the directors of college houses and academic services, and pre-major advisor for arts and sciences at the University of Pennsylvania. And Amber is now, she trained initially in pre-K to 12 education. That's where we met. We met at Arcadia University, and she's now working on a doctorate from Johns Hopkins. And the research that Amber is specializing is urban leadership, focusing on the social, emotional experiences of Black student leaders in high achieving institutions like the University of Pennsylvania. But also, Amber is an expert in dialogue. And we're going to talk a lot about that today. Trained in group relations, restorative practices, intergroup dialogue, just to name a few. Amber, how are you doing today?
I'm good. Happy to be here. Excited to have a good discussion and always happy to share space with you.
Yes, always happy to share space together. I tell you, folks, I met Amber in 2012, I believe.
Yep.
Yes. Amber, so that was 13 years ago, almost 13 years ago. It was the fall of 2012, and Amber was actually one of those beautiful students in one of my classes. We were reading between the rhymes, right?
Yes.
Exploring social justice through hip hop and media. And let me tell you, Amber, one of my favorite memories was a day, I think students were doing presentations and you just broke out in a rap. Yo, you took the whole class out. I was like, yes.
Sounds like me.
Yes, it was powerful. And I was like, oh, this one, there's something to be reckoned with right here. Yes. So, Amber, today's topic is 3 powerful pathways to deeper connection, understanding, and cultural competence. To get started, why don't you just share a little bit about your background and how you got started in this work, okay?
Yes, happy to do so. So for me, I think it would go back to that class reading between the lines, honestly. I think, of course, being a Black person with a lot of other intersectional, marginalized identities, life and its imbalances and inequities is something that, like, from a high school perspective, I thought about, but not with good language to really think more intentionally about. And then you hear from, like, my mom, who was a part of like desegregating schools in Philadelphia, like those stories. And it's like, okay, well, it's not that. So, like, maybe it's not, what you think it is. And also, I've luckily had a lot of really integrated school experiences being from a diverse city like Philadelphia, and being in the magnet system. So, you're getting students from all over the city rather than just neighborhood students. So, most of it was pretty inclusive, but there were small signs looking back along the way that, like, oh, things, aren't quite right. But I think once I got to college, being in more of a homogenous place where very few Black folks, even though we were right outside of Philadelphia, and then having that class, reading between the rhymes as well, kind of awoken my consciousness, if you will. And then coming back my sophomore year, I got invited to one of the clubs on campus, pushing our women of color to excel in the real world. And that's when we really started having those conversations about what's going on with women of color on campus, as well as in our society. Again, this is 2013. So some of those national stories of police brutality and things were becoming more common, unfortunately. And then joining Black Awareness Society and being a TA for your class as well. So really having those discussions with a lot of different people and a lot of different pockets of the university, really taking those to heart, and thinking as well at the time about being in a K-12 setting. How do we prepare our students that we're working with for life that is a little bit more harsh, and also having peers who are not Black or brown that spoke with the same apprehensions that our society pushes on people from those marginalized communities, and really thinking like, oh, something really should be done, because if these are the people we're entrusting with our tender children of the future, and they have those perspectives about these kids that they don't know and haven't met really, just based off of whatever's going on in our media and society, then we're probably not in a great place for the long term. So transitioning out of undergrad, I did make the shift to working with higher education, because I enjoyed the mentorship component and really wanted to be a long-term person for somebody to be able to lean on throughout all the craziness of society in a way that third graders would not be able to do, without being very problematic, and staying in their lives beyond the time that you have them. And so that was really one of the big driving forces for me working in higher ed. It's just I love student development, but I also love to be a long-term cog in the wheel. And I also appreciate people who have been long-term cogs in my wheel, like you, to help mentor and guide and shape and mold, to see what's possible down the road. And so in my graduate program, I went to University of San Diego. And while I was there, I was working in multicultural affairs at our intercultural center, supervising student leaders, and working on different programs, basically again around current events happening for people of color in that local area. So just shifting perspective from more Black students to more Latinx students, just because of the region that I was in, which is really super eye-opening and helpful just to get a more global perspective, even within the same country. There are just so many differences between the East and the West Coast. And I also worked really closely with their Black student group as well, as a graduate liaison, if you will, to support the undergraduate students in the conversations that they were having. And then my research and my master's was focused on empowering student leaders to be authentic within the workspace, specifically talking about them being people of color working in a multicultural center, but still finding themselves bumping up against the white status quo and what is that regard. And so it was really fruitful and eye opening to see that, slapping a name on a place doesn't necessarily mean that the ways in which people navigate a space are just automatically different. We're still working under the same constructs and the same restrictions that restrict us on a day to day basis, albeit well intended in this new space. And so that was something that was enriching, and also kind of sad to see that a lot of that stuff is still mirrored. And then as well, I started working on LGBT training, as well, facilitation while I worked there. So then switching over to Villanova, which is my first full-time institution that I worked at, working again with LGBT trainings there. But I also got introduced into intergroup relations. And so I became a adjunct faculty for that course. It's a 6-week dialogue course in the communications department, but focused on the different tiers of dialogue and building trust within communities, and also focused on one of the major social identifiers. So I worked in race relations for 2 semesters and worked on social economic status for 1 semester. And at a school like Villanova, where a lot of people are very, very wealthy, definitely helpful and interesting to have those conversations across finances in a way that I had never had before, and to hear those student experiences of people keeping up with the Joneses that you would think were pretty well off, and people that had money that I had never dreamed about having and couldn't necessarily relate to. And so just learning from them in a lot of helpful ways, and just seeing how our students are then combating those things and trying to show up in those spaces as well was pretty interesting. And then, yeah, now here at the University of Penn, I don't do as much targeted inclusion work these days. But I do feel like my model has always been we should all be doing all of this work, and it should be in every facet. And so for me, I'm somebody who's always asking the questions, raising the issues in my different pockets that I do have influence around. And then again, as mentioned, my research currently is around the social emotional experiences of Black student leaders. So in a lot of ways, I think it's always a part of me and something that I carry. Just sometimes the title might be more explicit to that work than other times. So
Right,
yeah.
understood. Yeah. And I think sometimes when it becomes a part of who you are, it's everywhere you are.
Right.
Right. And so I wanted to backtrack to that experience. You said those were group relations courses at Villanova or
Intergroup
group
relations. Yeah, it's
relations.
dialogue.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so building trust across identities. I was
Hmm.
curious about what were some of those things that you were learning
Hmm.
that can help us, right? Like we're trying to draw on whatever we can. And so what were some of those things that you were learning? And I mean, maybe one, two things. And what is it about the dialogue? So if there's somebody listening that might not understand intergroup dialogue.
Hmm.
Yeah. So
Yeah, so intergroup dialogue is basically sustained dialogue. So it does require for people to have to be meeting on a consistent basis. I think a lot of times people are like, "Oh, I want to have a dialogue, and we'll do like a singular brown bag lunch," and it's like, "Well, that you're not building trust in that space, so you're not going to reach the same depths as you would with sustained spaces." And so the different steps that you kind of move through in group life is forming and setting the stage. So building rules, establishing trust, having explicit community guidelines, which a lot of folks in DI spaces do build those even before a regular training. But I think again, just getting that buy-in and having everyone feel like they have ownership in what's agreed upon to make them then want to lean more into that. And then as well as light icebreakers. So not starting off with the so how has your SES impacted your life? That's usually not a great way to ease people into conversation. And so keeping it more light, centered around the theme as much as possible, but as a way to just get to know people as people before diving into that. And then the next would be exploring the differences and the commonalities. So making it explicit, you come into a group, the race courses are a little bit more easy to identify people visually. But again, you might be making assumptions and someone will share something and you find out something totally different. And I think especially with the economic status one, you can look at a group of people and not tell anything about where people come from, how they were raised, and what they had to their disposal as they grew up. And so that's really an opportunity once we've set the foundation to lean into exploring those differences and commonalities with an open mind and remaining curious. The
mm,
next step then is deepening understanding and engaging in conflict. As we know, conflict is necessary to grow. I think when people hear the word conflict, they think like, oh, a big fight and a blow up. And it's like, no, like if you're dealing with people that have very different perspectives and understandings, their outlooks are then shaped by that. The ways in which they view the world are shaped by that. The people who they've rubbed elbows with in their lifetime are very different than the people that you've rubbed elbows with. And so now we're starting to have those conversations about power and privilege and systems of inequalities. And again, removing the individual from like, oh, just because you were rich does not mean that then you were the oppressor in every dynamic that you were part of, but opening it up to, well, how did you arrive at that point? What resources did you have access to that maybe your other classmates didn't? How was this possibly by design? And really being able to pull in those historical contexts and think about contemporary issues and navigating that discomfort in a
mhm.
productive manner.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that there weren't times of unproductivity and where a student maybe had to remove themselves from a dialogue for the moment. And one of the key components of managing these spaces is having multiple facilitators in the class. So I
Mm,
typically was with 1 to 2 other facilitators at any point so that someone can leave, support the student that's outside the circle while still maintaining the circle and having that dialogue continue to go on. We also
mhm.
take breaks throughout the class for that, have snacks, recharge and refuel them as well. And then lastly, the building alliances and taking action phase is the hope for where you would arrive at by week 6 or 7. Some groups move to that phase more, I guess, efficiently than other groups. But again, we never wanted to force like allyship and coalition building, because if the people are not ready for that just yet, we don't want to
Mhm,
make broken promises. So we'd rather you get to the understanding and conflict and take the building alliance and action piece with you as something that you can work on as a longer term project for student life and student self discovery.
mhm,
I
mhm,
think as far as the big learning things that I can recall, I think especially when socioeconomic status is concerned, that feeling of
mhm,
thinking you're the only one that doesn't have it. Villanova is a very homogenous institution. At the time that I worked there, they were 77% white, and I believe 70% that were in upper middle class or higher. So it wasn't, too far fetched to think that everyone around you has, what they need and can live life in excess. But
mhm,
of course, there's still a big chunk of students that do not fit into that mold. And so,
mhm,
really helping students, I think it's a elementary thing, but to know that you're not alone in the situation is still real, and breaking down that, keeping up with the Joneses type of facade. At Penn, we call it Penn face, but just like keeping it as if nothing is wrong, everything is great. And so
mhm,
just really having a community where people can leave the cliques that they formed and come into a space where you're meeting people from all across campus that you otherwise wouldn't have talked to. We would have athletes to the arts to humanities folks, and it's continuing to grow from talking to colleagues that are still over there. So I think again, just building that community and sense of I'm not alone was a big learning piece. I think the other piece that was always enriching was when white folks in my race classes can really see the ways in which the system, like I feel like when people talk about race, it's like, oh, I'm not a racist. Like, okay, yes. And like, let's talk about the systems. I think taking that time to really get into the systems dynamic of it all, and to hear 4 or 5 examples of people from all different parts of the country, some maybe not even from the country, that have some type of a shared experience related to their race, in a way we're like, okay, this can't be just a coincidence. There's something deeper happening. And so that was always enriching. And then the last thing that was actually unexpected for me was I had one student who was a transracial adoptee. And so we
mhm,
had a really interesting dialogue around what did it mean to be an Asian woman, but to be raised in an Italian family, and
mhm,
not really knowing the traditions of Asian culture. And so not only do you feel like an outsider within your own racial group because you don't share those same, ways of upbringing or ideologies or teachings. And I didn't wear jade when I was younger, even though a lot of other Asian kids wore jade, like those little small
mhm,
things that you would think you would have in common. But then when you're relating to white people, they're like, well, yeah, you don't really quite look like me either. But it's like, oh, but I had this dinner and this tradition that actually is shared with you. And so, as me as an adopted person, and who was fostered in white families and adopted by a black person and am a black person, but don't have real conscious memory of those dynamics and having to deal with that, I did find it super enriching. And I think that
mhm,
student was challenged the most in the class because it was like, okay, we're going to do caucus time for 30 minutes. It's like, well, where do you go in this
mm,
caucus time,
mm,
and where
yeah.
do you feel like you most belong? But then where do you actually belong? And how do you
Mhm,
tell someone that or help guide them through that decision as a 19, 20-year old? So I think for her, that would be definitely something that will take a longer journey of questioning and self-discovery to find out. But to be able to be a launching pad for that was really rewarding and helpful,
mhm.
I think, to the whole class to see how complex some of these conversations can end up
Can
being.
be. Yeah. And you know what? I just had a thought. I've thought about this before, but you brought it back, and that is how some of these strategies that have been put in place in formal contexts in colleges and universities can be used in workplaces, right?
Yeah.
Um, because if the goal is, and I mean, you said a lot of things, right? Like sustained, well, not the goal, but the process was sustained dialogue,
Mm-hmm.
um, that included ownership of agreements,
Mm-hmm.
um, for people to get to know one another. They were exploring differences. A key is to remain curious and to establish deep connection and manage conflict and then build alliances and collective action,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, that process makes sense to me, right? If there are people going to work every day, right? We talk about all kinds of things at work, our politics, our dating, our family lives, our whatever. But if it's left to a sound bite,
Mm-hmm.
right? It may not, that communication may not be used to really build trusting relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And we all know there's decades, and books and books and books and books and other references that tell us that, when we build trust in these workplace relationships, man, people will walk through walls for that company,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? Like
Very
for the
much.
company, for each other.
Mm-hmm.
And why not along the way have these humans actually have deep connection
Right.
to one another? You don't know where that could lead.
Right.
The
Mm-hmm.
benefits are exponential.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I could just see, this focus on dialogue. And you've been through quite a few different types.
Mm-hmm.
And not that you have to break down the different types, but you say that they are all powerful pathways to deeper connection,
Mm-hmm.
understanding, and your cultural competence. And you just described that, right? You described how your cultural competence increased
Right.
by being a facilitator of those dialogues, right?
Yeah.
So I can imagine what happened for the people, the participants, and then the wonderfully complex experience of someone with identities where we're used to thinking about someone like racially,
Mm-hmm.
for example, and making it have meaning, but it changes in the context, right?
Right. Right.
So this person is adopted from another country and is in a family that identifies as, well, I think you said Italian
Italian, white
or
American.
right,
Yeah.
right, right. There's some people listening who will be like, they're Italian, they're not white, but that is a whole nother conversation. I think it might be a Philly thing.
Yeah.
But anyway. And so, um, but yeah, so there's this person that has that kind of experience. And it's interesting. One of my greatest learnings, or I had an experience with some graduate students where we had a student in the room
Mm-hmm.
who was adopted, and we were watching a film called Daughter from Da Nang, and the film explores the it wasn't the woman's life, but it was her journey back home. So she was a an adoptee from Vietnam, and she was raised by a white woman here. I mean, this was complicated too because actually children were taken, like were lied to by the government. People were lied to in the government, well, by the government during the Vietnam War. These were children who were, um, children of soldiers and a Vietnamese
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
person, and the the people told them that they were going to get their children back, and that wasn't true. Yeah, so they took them. But anyway, we watch this film, there's a lot of different cultural conflicts, right? And like clashes between like the person who was adopted, her understanding of the rules, right? And how we communicate about certain things. One particular sticking point was money.
Mm-hmm.
And people in the class, when asked their immediate reactions. They were like, she should have known, like she should have did all of this work to prepare herself. The company that supported her should have done a better job, and maybe they should have, right? But I remember this lone voice at that time, right? So I've shown it multiple times, and this lone voice said, "Wait a minute, when you're adopted, like that is you're not thinking about all of that."
Right.
Right? Like you are not thinking about all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And people started challenging her.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to step in because I thought, wow, like what keeps you from believing her?
Right. Right.
Yeah. Like
Mm-hmm.
what keeps you from that is her experience. That is reality then,
Right.
just
Right.
like yours is yours,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so I think these dialogue spaces help us raise our ability to really not just be kind, right? But be, I don't know, just be better humans.
Yeah, yeah. And to be able to push up against something and have the space and the breath to do so. We were talking before we started recording about something, an opportunity you have to do a facilitation. You're like, it's 90 minutes. I don't know how much space I'll have to actually like do the real important work. And I think that's often what we see in these things. We bring in people for a 20-minute, 30-minute,
Mhm,
90-minute session. And, we
mhm,
think that's the stamp of approval and you're done. It's like, no, we actually could benefit so much more from that longer sustained. You know what? This is where we're going to pause today. We'll see each other a week from now, mull over this point, and we'll come back to it a little less charged, a little bit more
yes.
reflective, with a little bit more curiosity and be able to dive back in. And that's something that I really do miss and had appreciated about being a part of that kind of a space in the community. Because even in
Mm,
some of the other dialogues that I'm a part of, this is the only one that has been sustained in a way that you really do, and again, sustained over a long period of time. Because I think with group relations, which you might talk about shortly, those are often weekend long or up to
okay.
2 weeks long situations.
Mhm,
And so it's intense and it can be a lot that you learn. And it's like, well, that was a flash in the pan, and like before
mm,
you realize it, it's over. Versus like coming into a class in January and not being done until late March, you really
mhm.
get to see yourself grow over the months and two months that you have together. So.
Yes, okay, and 6 contacts, right? Like, so
Mhm,
it was like 6 times.
mhm.
Well, and again, we don't have to get into all of the details of group relations but what is another, like, a core factor in the group relations? And I believe you talk about restorative practices. Like,
Yeah.
what are key ingredients?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll maybe start with restorative practices just because that's probably
Okay.
the oldest form because it comes from ancient origins and indigenous cultures around the world. But there's different forms of approaching restorative practices. I would say most of which that I've been a part of have been like Native American formats, even though I'm sure there's overlaps there. But basically, there's circles of accountability, deep listening, and compassionate understanding. And so the circles of accountability basically started as another way to repair relationships and as I would say opposite to the judicial system. You'll actually
Mhm,
see some smaller organizations in states and in cities that are adopting restorative practices as a potential process for someone to go through to be able to pay their debts to whatever wrongdoing that had done. And
mhm,
the focus is really on giving the power back to the community and often back to the individual who might have been the center of the harm that was done. We see that at a few of the universities I've worked at, they were bringing that in when I was at Villanova, is when I first got trained through the Restorative Practices Catholic Coalition, I believe is what it's
mhm,
called. And then again, when I got to Penn, they have an office under their student conduct office that now has branched out to be a party of four. When I first got here, it was only one person working. So
okay.
it's grown exponentially, even in the 4 short years that I've been at Penn.
Mhm,
And you see it a lot with neighbor issues, as
mhm.
well as sexual assault and violence in that regard as well, to give
Mm,
the power back to the individual about they were harmed. What do you want to see? How do we give accountability and give the power back to the person? And so sometimes that looks like having a circle where everyone is in the space together in some issues of big harms. There's a lot of conferences that happen before that with the restorative practice facilitator about, what is it that you need? How do we make steps towards that? And they never bring in the person who harmed someone unless they have fully bought in as well. Because the last thing we want is to bring someone back into the space to do it now double harm on a person or an
Mhm.
individual. So there's like a delicate balance to strike there. But a lot of it is around having a talking piece. Only one person is speaking at a time. The facilitator usually, again, you usually want to have two facilitators in this space as well, but you can have one is able to kind of summarize what's going on, ask further questions to deepen that. You typically use like a sandwich method of sorts, kind of like feedback sessions and relations or something where you give a lighter question or entry point type of thing, the tough stuff in the middle, and then kind
Mhm.
of a hope for the future. So again, a little bit lighter towards the end of that. And then often ending with some type of one breath check out or something of that nature as well. And
Mhm.
again, the deep listening piece is that there's only one person talking, which means most of
Mhm.
the time you're doing a lot of active listening, which again is trying to be a space where you're understanding someone and having curiosity, listening to understand instead of listening to respond. And you're forced kind of into that because if you're holding on to your response for five people, you miss what five people had to say by thinking about what it is that you want to say. And then again, there's, in both spaces, it could be either Native American or I think also Buddhist philosophy is entrenched in that compassionate understanding as well. So I say those are like the flavor of restorative practices and how circles might be approached. And then as far as group relations, we focus more on systems psychodynamics and able to address the interplay between psychological forces and systemic structures within organizations, but honestly, within any type of group. So when we're in a conference, it's usually, well, it's typically in person. I think with COVID, a lot of things started to move on to Zoom sometimes. So that has persisted some too. But you're in a circle format for a lot of the sessions. Circles and spirals are the ways that you would typically identify the spatial setups in those spaces. And you're working in small groups and large groups as well, and also intermediate size groups. The small groups are really focused on basic assumptions and how people I guess how you fall into simple assumptions within groups, the niceties and things that you play when you're in a space that you don't really know for the first time. So you'll often see like meanness where like you're pulling yourself away from what's going on in the group and like, oh no, but and it's like, okay, but this is still happening in a space that you exist in. So what's the part that you might be playing in this? And
Mhm.
then the oneness where it's like, oh, we all believe the same thing and we all get along and nothing's wrong here. And it's like, well, as you know, you bring together people from different backgrounds and things like that. There is some conflict there. Whether you're choosing to not address it is a different conversation. And then that would beg the question as to like, why are we ignoring it and acting like we don't want to address it? And
Mhm.
the root of that comes from a psychoanalyst from Britain, Wilford Bion. It's kind of like the starter of the conversations around this. And he started to do groups as a reaction to one of the world wars to understand power and leadership and authority is really where it first started, but then kind of has sprinkled out into more identity based things. And then, depending on the organization, also spirituality is sometimes looped into that too, because there's the idea that we're all a part of a collective unconscious. And so,
Mhm.
what is that unconscious force that we're pulling from? And
Mhm.
then, we'll typically say too in life, you'll see things come up for you maybe in different forms until you deal with it. And that's where the idea of the spiral is of like, you're going to continue to see a lesson until you finally learn what you're supposed to learn from that lesson. And
Mhm.
that our opportunity to be in a group that you don't really know too many people, a temporary system. If you see something come up here that's showing up in your work or in your family life, then like there's
Mhm.
probably something about you that is bringing this dynamic up. And so really it's thinking about the combined hidden agendas that group members might
Mhm.
have from a subconscious or maybe sometimes a conscious level. And then in contrast with the rational group and thinking about what the tasks like the hard tasks are and the deliverables are that we need that are stopping us between the unconscious wishes, fears, defenses, fantasies, impulses, and projections that we might have, and really untangling that for each other. So we often act a lot faster than we're actually thinking about why we're acting and what we're acting and what we're enacting. And so it gives us, a weekend or a week to explore that, to be curious about that, to show up in different groups, and to have people show a mirror to yourself, honestly, is the way I like to think about it. A lot of the group relations work reminds me of the concept of Johari's window
Window.
model.
Mhm.
Yeah, where you're digging into that blind area and the hidden area of yourself where, you might know things about yourself, but you've been hiding that from others. But then you might have that then come up for you where you say it out loud, and then that opens up something for you in a different way.
Right.
Or on the
Right.
opposite side, you might not know that you're doing certain things as far as the blind spots are concerned. And so now people are
Mhm.
able to give you that mirror. They're not as nice about it because they don't have a reason to be, and you're in this pressure cooker. And so you can then walk away and be like, oh, I never realized that maybe I was doing this. And it might not be like one of those things where you're just an awful human being. It could be
Mhm.
something where it's like, oh, I never realized I find myself in these type of relationships as a blind spot for me because of something that happened to me when I was 5, and now I continue to
Mhm.
reenact that as an adult type of thing. So,
Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah.
they're both different models, but still offer a way to think deeper and be more curious about yourself
Right.
and others.
I was curious how you bring the elements that you've learned, right, into your work life, personal life, whatever. It could be volunteer work or whatever. Like, where do you find yourself, where you're saying, "Oh, I'm drawing on, intergroup
Yeah.
dialogue, group relations, or restorative practices."
Yeah. So concretely, right now I
Mhm.
sit on the board of the Difficult Dialogues National Research Center, which is
Mhm.
literally focused all on dialogue. And most of us that are a part of it have done some type of IGD work, intergroup dialogue, intergroup relations work. And so every month I'm meeting multiple times a month, literally working with people who are like-minded. Right now I'm working on the conference committee as a co-chair. We have a conference coming up this summer. If you would like to
Mhm.
join us, check out the DBNRC website for more information on that, at WashU. And then working with people as well in the executive board, which is kind of more of an oversight of all the different sub functions that we have. We actually just had a training workshop session last week. It was a panel with 4 different higher ed professionals from across campuses talking about how we can use dialogue with the current times that we're in and the stress of people's offices and fundings and things like that being at risk. So that's like a more concrete type. I would
Mhm.
say on a lower level, using like restorative practices, for example, there's 3 tiers in restorative practices. The first tier is just community building, that foundational
Mhm.
piece. And then the second tier being more of the circle component. And then the last is like the more intensive conferencing. And I use tier one all the time. I think it's super important to build that foundation, to have people be able to be active listeners, to have opportunities to build community. So that way, when we need to lean on each other during more tougher times, we've already established the foundation there. I think nothing is worse than being a collective of humans, then having something bad or crazy go down. And now you're leaning on each other, but you barely know each other. You don't,
Mhm.
like if you don't know each other's working styles and everything is going great, a horrible time to learn is when
Right.
everything is not going great. So
Right.
I definitely value that, and just yeah, that individual being able to speak and have the floor. I think there's something empowering about that as
Mhm.
well. It's something that I actually really always appreciated from Quaker schools when I did
Mhm.
a couple of my teaching experiences there during training, of just giving people the opportunity to have the floor. And I think that sounds small, but there's so many times where we're in spaces where you don't really get your full thought out, you know?
Mhm.
And so there's just something about that, being able to voice something and feel empowered in that way. And then I would say, as far as my group relations aspects are concerned, I kind of think of it in a similar way that I think about like the ways in which we talk about church, and that like when there's 2 or more gathered, something's going on. Like I feel like that's so true in group relations. That like once you're with someone else, you are now not an individual. You're now a part of a group. And
Mm.
so, what are the ways in which that I show up in groups? How am I able to learn some things and be conscious about things that I otherwise wasn't, and then make decisions about, do I want to continue that or not. I think one of the misconceptions about group relations is like, oh, once something is illuminated to you, then you have to do something about it. And it's like, well, that's not always true. Like maybe I'm content with this thing that I've learned about myself. And it just helps me be able to have the backstory as to how I arrived here in a way that I otherwise wasn't thinking about it. And then in other ways, it does mean that maybe I want to shift. I think one example is me being a classmate in my master's program. So my current program is online, so I don't feel the same interpersonal dynamic things that happen because I'm in my own home at my own time. But I think in my master's program, or no, that I had run into a lot of situations where I was trying to convey certain messages, but it was just not being received at all.
Mm,
And it didn't matter what way. Sometimes it didn't matter what way I was saying it. I felt like I wasn't received. But I think in ironing that out a little bit more and realizing that like I'm giving the power to others to care so much about the ways in which it's received, and that charged me up more in the way that was non-productive than productive. And
mm,
so being able to take that chargedness out of it, that like pressure out of the ways in which I'm communicating, and being a little bit more matter of factly about it, and being able to draw from like, okay, if this is how I feel, where's the evidence in the room to support how I feel? And really
mm,
laying it out pretty plainly of like, okay, I said this, it didn't feel like it was taken up. I saw other people say this is how the group responded. And so I'm just curious, like, what is it about the ways that this can be presented in one way and not taken up, and can be presented by in another way and be taken up? And is it the way, or is it the person it's coming out of? Is it what I represent for others? And really being curious, going back to the earlier point about what's happening. And I find myself doing similar methods of that in my professional life, as well as having the student groups that I work with, if that's going on amongst them, pushing them to be curious about what's going on amongst each other as well.
mhm.
So yeah, those would be probably the ways I can see that showing up in my day to day.
Okay. And I'm curious now. Like when you talked about the group relations
Mhm.
specifically, in the so you alluded to your master's program. Where did you land? Did you land at some places where you made choices to shift or not shift?
Yeah, so I would say the shifting piece would be the part I just shared about the how my delivery maybe wasn't
Did
landing the best for certain groups of people. And I
Yeah.
think I always like think to myself, and I think we probably all think highly of ourselves, but that like I
Okay.
am a good-hearted, kind person in general. Is I think if that wasn't the case, then there would be a whole lot more to be
Hmm.
curious and interested about. But again, it's like, well, what is your audience and what are you trying to convey? And I think we've had conversations offline, and just like not wanting to compromise yourself and your being, but
Okay.
also doing what is needed within reason to get to your ultimate goal. And typically my goal is always something that's just on the other side of it, but it's about making it relatively palatable, right? I think there's a
Okay.
threshold that like you know it when you feel it, when you're like overly
Hmm.
compromising yourself to the point of like
Hmm.
this isn't worth it. But I do think that there is like a middle ground of like, okay, like something that's happening right now. For example, we were talking in one of our trainings with our student workers when I was in my master's program about different subsets of racial identities. And one of the groups happened that we were doing, I think it was Enneagrams, ended up being that most of the Asian folks were in a specific number of Enneagram, but one of our students from Sri Lanka was not. I think she was in my group. And we were just a hodgepodge where like no one had the same number that we had. And our supervisor at the time was like, oh, all the Asian students are in, whatever number. And I was like, oh, well, like that's not that's not true. Like she's literally not inside that group. And
Hmm.
like it was received poorly by my supervisor at the time. I think probably just like the shame of it all, instead of just owning like, oh, I spoke out of term. But now it's like, oh, well, she's not that same kind of Asian. And so now we're going back and forth on like, okay, well, you said Asian in general, and
Hmm.
like later on, the student coming up to me and like being seen and felt valued, that I did stand up
Hmm.
for her in that way. And so
Okay.
like there's a side of like, okay, the person who I was addressing couldn't receive it, but also what I was doing seemed just, and I got that affirmation that it was just. So then it's thinking about, okay, what might have been a better way that I could have said this in order for it to be received better? Or also, is it like that person just wasn't willing to receive it in general? So, it's that tight walk that you walk. But I think it's like a similar thing in that vein where it's like you see something wrong, how do you bring it to a group in a way that it's able
Mhm.
to be worked with instead of immediately shut down?
Mhm.
And that way that not only can my voice feel powerful, but then the student maybe would have found an entryway to also express that in the group about how
Mhm.
harmful it felt to be excluded from her people versus later only in a one-on-one conversation after the
Right.
fact.
Right.
And so yeah, I would say that for sure.
Mhm.
And then can you remind me what
Well,
you
oh, the question.
answered, or
Well,
can you remind me what the question was? I don't know if I answered.
yeah, I think, well, you did answer, but
Okay,
I
okay.
want, yeah, because I was just thinking about, like, I wanted a
Oh,
real
about where I
clear
shifted or where I
example,
didn't shift.
right?
Okay, so yeah,
And
yeah,
a
yeah.
real clear example. Yeah, go
Yeah,
ahead.
I have another one, but less about,
Oh,
I guess, like anti-racism things.
it's fine.
Yeah, where I didn't shift.
Okay.
But maybe I did talk to you or didn't talk to you about it. But I because I'm an adoptee, my
Mm,
first formative years of life were with white women specifically, actually, and two different family units. One of which was like an older white lady, and then the other was I don't know how old the white lady was, but I also had four older sisters that were like older
mm,
teens to young 20s.
mm,
And then in my dating life, I found myself being more open to white women in a way that, like, the way that I was raised and the way that I felt about racial dynamics and stuff, like people
mhm.
would think was misaligned. Like I feel like I was questioned a few different times in relationships with white women where it's like, oh, I would have never thought that you had a white girlfriend. And so like for me, it's like, oh, okay, well, I'm not thinking about that deeply. I don't know, how I'm ending up in these situations, but like I'm a pupilist. I'm like, as long as the person is good and they are willing to have those tough conversations, and whatever, I love all people. But I think through going through the conferences, I like dive deeper into like how my adopted year or fostered years influence who I am as an adult,
Mhm.
and how I navigate group spaces and how I'm open to different things. And it's an assumption, I don't know that to be 100% true, but I do think that there probably was a link to having your initial caretakers be these white feminine people, and then people always say like, oh, people grow up and they'll either date someone that's just like their parents or like the antithesis of their parents. And like, I think there's like a hidden level there of like, oh, my openness and willingness to be in these dynamics probably has something to do, even though not so conscious memories, but I have pictures and stuff like that, of the dynamics that I was in before and seeking that caretakingness again, even if it
Right.
looks different and takes on a different form, and being okay with that. I didn't end up
That's right.
marrying white, but I stayed open to that, even with that knowledge of that. And it was just helpful
Mhm.
to know the backstory of like, okay, this might be how I arrived here, which is a different perspective than I had had all those years and just
Mhm.
living and enacting and doing my life.
That's right. Yeah. And yeah, thinking about why we do what we do, the way we communicate is powerful in my mind, right?
Mhm.
Like just when one is can do whatever you can to be self-aware
Mhm.
and then self-manage, right? Like with others when you're in that quote unquote group, right? Is I think helps us move through life in ways that serve us well.
Mhm.
Now, have you experienced challenges in relation to the work that you do in general? Like, are there general common challenges that you've encountered on the journey of establishing deeper connection and understanding and building up the cultural competence of other people?
Yeah, I would say less so with the students that I work with and more
Mhm.
so on the teams. I think that we often, at least in the spaces I've been a part of, get so preoccupied with changing the students and being having the student experience be better and all those things, which is what we need to do and is great. But as the old black saying goes, the fish rots from the head. And I feel like we don't
Oh, I never heard
focus
that.
Oh, you never heard that? Yes, the fish fries from the head down. And so if you're not focused on the leadership and the professional staff of it all, then
Mhm.
whatever it is that you're doing with the students is not going to be as impactful and as effective as one would like it to be.
Mhm.
So I'm always here for the let's do our work. And we talk about that in group relations too. Like if the collective unconscious is real, if in somewhere in the system work is being done, then the idea is that it opens up a portal for work to get done in another piece of the system. And
Mhm.
so a lot of times, and again, it kind of goes back to my story of back at USD. It's like if the supervisor doesn't want to hear and acknowledge their own wrongdoings, then how can we work with students and say, oh, when you get something wrong, don't make it a whole big deal and make it about you. Apologize and learn, look for a way forward. And it's like,
Mhm.
okay, well, that's not happening, within our own team. We're not modeling
Mhm.
what we're preaching. And so
Right.
I find that to be a common thread within organizations I'm a part of, where
Mhm.
I'm pushing for like our work to be getting done. But it is vulnerable work. It is hard
Mhm.
work, especially for people who aren't necessarily having to lean into that more frequently. I think
Mhm.
if you have privileged identities, you don't have to, you have the privilege of not having to go through all of the questioning and self-identifying and doing that, piece breaking apart to piece back together of it all, that I think ultimately makes a lot of people who have marginalized identities, especially in our society, have to grow and learn at a more exponential rate, because we have to not only learn ourselves, but we have to
Mhm.
learn the others that are in privileged spaces and how we're perceived in those spaces in order to be as successful in navigating society as possible. So I would
Mhm.
say, yeah, supervisors, honestly, because even though I have like subsets of people that I run, I'm still always answering to somebody else.
Mhm.
And I think, that person is answering to somebody else all the way up until the president, I guess, who is answering to the board chair. So,
Mhm.
it's that we're all answering to somebody. But I think when the person who at least has the say so of a bigger subset of people, especially with senior leadership and professional staff, to be able to get them to see the value and sustainable work around this, that has been the challenge.
Yeah.
It's not been too challenging to get a one-off session or to be like, okay, we'll institute this new practice at our team meetings, and then 3 weeks later, something else big came up, and now we no longer are prioritizing this part of our
Right.
team meetings. And now, next thing you know, 2 years went by, and it's like,
Mhm.
we need to have a dialogue. And it's like, well, I thought we said we were going to have mini dialogues every other meeting 2 years ago.
Right.
What happened to that?
Right, right. And had you had that, maybe you didn't need to return to it. Yeah,
Exactly.
yes.
So, yes.
Yeah. And these are things that many of us don't think about. I was just working with the organization. We were talking about prioritizing, right? And you prioritize what's mission critical, like the things
Hmm.
that keep you afloat, that are foundational to the organization existing. And oftentimes we think that at the top, right, is just those things we do every day or have to do
Exactly.
frequently, or emergencies, but
Mm,
they are just emergencies. They're
right.
not
Right. Mm-mm.
right where we need to stay focused. And you said something earlier that's critical, that when those emergencies come up, if you are not a team that knows one another, that trusts
Mhm.
one another,
Mhm.
it is a hard thing to try to build during the emergency, which implies that it's necessary.
Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
quite necessary.
Yes. Yes.
Oh, wow. This has been a powerful conversation. I really appreciate your insights and the personal work that you've done and your effort, your intention to practice what you preach. Yes,
Thank you.
good stuff. Yes, I agree totally. We can't give what we don't have.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, are we really helping our students if we don't do the work? Are we
Exactly.
helping the employees we supervise lead if we don't do the work?
Right. And I think a lot of that, at least in my experience with the two people I'm thinking about as past
Mhm.
supervisors, I wonder if there's this like so much shame there of just like if I open up this can of worms of how problematic I might have been or how much I might have contributed to these systems of oppression, like that would be just too much for me to face in front
Mhm.
of people that then have to respect me and that I
Mhm.
have power over. And so instead, it's easy to just like snuff it out
Yeah.
and to do just enough to get by than to like really get in there to the nasty, ugly root of it all.
And that was probably modeled for them too,
Exactly. That's
right?
true.
Because it's been modeled for many of us. This is
Mhm.
uncommon. What
Yeah.
we're talking about is uncommon, but so necessary.
Yeah.
And I'm here to say I'm so grateful that, to be among the few. I don't want us to be a few though, right?
Right.
But grateful to be among the few that have that perspective and that are trying to get other people to understand its value, like its
Yeah.
permanence, its
Mhm.
sustainability. It's sustainable,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And another note I wanted to make, so earlier you were talking about, people with privileged identities. I want to be clear that you see faces of two African American women
Yeah.
in front of you, those of you on YouTube, right? So you see that, right? However, we're not saying, oh, we
You
don't
don't have
have
privilege.
privileged
Yeah.
identities,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So one very major key privileged identity I know I have is as a Christian in the United States, and maybe around the world, and um, heterosexual identity. As you know, I those are two major privileges for me that I had to understand and come to know. Like I didn't always understand it,
Right.
right? And when I did that, it helped me understand why some white folks don't get racism. This I was like, aha.
Oh, really? That's so funny. Yeah, I feel like for me, I don't have the sexual orientation privilege, but I do have the Christian privilege. But it's actually been very easy for me, almost to the point where sometimes I be like having to do a quick prayer afterwards, like, Lord, just because I'm challenging about the way that they're, giving space to Christianity doesn't mean that I'm anti that. I'm just like, we give so much space for Christianity. What
Mm,
about the rest of these religions and the
right,
students that fall under that? So for
right.
me, I think, and again, I wonder if that has to do with like all the other ways in which I have a decent amount of marginalization. That
Mhm,
like it's easy for me to put myself in the shoe of the other,
mhm,
especially as it comes to Christianity, and also because of who I am sexual orientation wise and the ways
mhm,
in which I have been marginalized even within Christianity along
mhm.
my journey. That maybe is a different dynamic for folks that have felt included in their own faith as well. So yeah.
Yes. Yes. But at the end of the day, we want to thrive. We want to connect, understand, build our competence. And you have definitely given us a masterclass today on some pathways to get there. Is there any final advice you would give to someone looking to improve in these areas?
That's a great question. Um, I lean into your own mess. I think we're all a
Okay.
mess a little bit.
Okay.
I
All
think
right.
if you
That's good
realize,
stuff.
yeah, kind of back to the early point with the IGD of like
Mhm.
you're not alone in this concept. I think if we continue to be real with ourselves, we will all realize that we all have some things that we need to fix about ourselves and look in the mirror about and grow from. And
Mhm.
I don't remember who used to tell me this, but it was like if you stop growing, then you probably did. Like if they,
Mm.
you wouldn't be on this earth if you weren't meant to be continuing to grow and to learn and to do something different. And I think
Yes.
that's hard for people who like, well, this has been working for me within the capitalist patriarchal society that I live in, which
Mm.
be true. And when we think about the collective, is that can you say the same thing?
Yeah.
And we need each other to survive. We're communal beings as humans. So dig into your mess and realize that
Mhm.
you got somebody hopefully will be digging into theirs next to you, or if not, invite them to bring their mess with you as you model that behavior that you want to see in the world.
Yes. Thank you again and again and again. So, Amber, I want to really, this has been an honor. I can't really thank you enough for what you've shared today. How can people find you after this episode?
Probably my LinkedIn would be the best place. So linkedin.com/AmberNW numbers 414, or also Amber N Williams on LinkedIn, but I have a pretty common name. So I would say
Okay,
use the at if you can, which is again Amber NW 414.
thank you. And that's Amber N as in Nancy, W as in work,
Yeah.
414. All right, excellent. Well, rooted to try. Oh, excuse me. Rooted to thrive tribe. It's about that time. I want to thank you for being here and being willing to grow with us. And please just leave a comment, subscribe, share this episode. And thank you again for listening to Rooted to Thrive.
Thank you.
Thank